Rochester, New York, autumn 1862. You are sitting in a parlor that smells of mercury vapor and lavender water. A gas lamp hisses against the wall. The wallpaper is the color of dried blood, partly because that is what was fashionable that year, and partly because the dye contains arsenic, but nobody in this room is thinking about that yet. In front of you, a wooden box camera on a brass tripod. Behind the lens, a man in a black frock coat with chemical stains on his cuffs. He has not slept in 2 days. He has been booked for 2 weeks. And in the velvet chair across from him, a small girl in a white christening gown sits with her hands folded in her lap. Her cheeks are rosy. Her hair has been brushed. She has not blinked in 3 days. This is what you came here for. The dead child in the photograph, the famous Victorian thing. You have seen the images. You have shared them on a Friday night with a glass of wine, captioned with words like creepy and wild, and imagine living back then. You think you know this story. You do not. Almost everything you have been told about Victorian death photography in America is wrong. It is wrong in the easy ways, the social media ways, the propped up corpses and the iron stands that everyone repeats and nobody verifies. It is wrong in the harder ways, too. The ways that involve smell, the ways that involve what was actually happening in that parlor in Rochester for the full 60 seconds the shutter was open. The numbers are not the horror. The numbers are just the bill. 1 in 4 American children dead before the age of 5. A war chewing through a generation of farm boys in Pennsylvania cornfields. Cholera in the summer. Diphtheria in the winter. Bodies moving through the parlor the way mail moves through a post office. The horror is the silence around the camera, because here is what nobody tells you. In most of these photographs, you are not looking at one dead person. You are looking at one dead person and a room full of living people pretending to be calm for a minute and a half, while a stranger with chemical burns on his hands tells them where to put their hands. You are looking at a mother who washed her own daughter that morning. You are looking at a father holding a stick to keep a head from tilting forward. You are looking at a brother who has been told that if he moves, his sister will be remembered wrong forever. And sometimes, on the plates that still survive in archives in Vermont and Ohio and upstate New York, you are looking at someone else, someone the photographer did not invite, someone the family did not bring. Welcome to the dark ledge. For the next 40 minutes, you are going to learn what the chemicals actually smelled like. You are going to learn which famous standing corpse photographs are actually living people and why that is so much worse. You are going to meet a man named William Mumler, who sold the ghost of Abraham Lincoln to his widow for $10 in a Boston studio in 1872. You are going to meet a family in Vermont whose dead infant opened her eyes between exposures on a plate that no university will let you see anymore. Here is the thesis, and you can leave now if you want. Victorian death photography in America was never really about preserving the dead. The dead were already gone. The dead were the easy part. It was about the living people trapped in the room with them, holding very still for a very long minute, while something on the other side of the lens learned every face it would need to find later. Subscribe to the Dark Ledge for real dark history. Not the candle and lace version, the version with the smell. Before that lens could learn anything, somebody had to build it. And before that wooden box camera ended up in a parlor in Rochester pointed at a dead child, America spent 23 years deciding this was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The daguerreotype lands in the United States in 1839. The man who carries it across the Atlantic is Samuel Morse, the same Morse you half remember from your 7th grade unit on the telegraph. He meets Louis Daguerre in Paris, sees the process demonstrated by candlelight, and gets on a boat home with the secret in his pocket. Within 6 months, Boston has a studio. Within 18 months, every major American city has one. By 1853, there are roughly 86 daguerreotype studios in New York City alone, stacked along Broadway like dentists' offices, advertising in the newspapers next to ads for liver pills and runaway slaves. That is the polite history. Here is the math underneath it. In the United States in the 1850s, roughly 1 in 4 children dies before the age of 5. In the poorer wards of Philadelphia and Lower Manhattan, closer to 1 in 3. Cholera arrives every summer in the river cities like clockwork. Diphtheria moves through the one-room schoolhouses in the winter and takes whole rows. Scarlet fever comes back for the second child after taking the first, then sometimes the third. There is a phrase in the household manuals of the period for the gastric illness that killed infants in July and August. They called it the summer complaint, which is the kind of name you give something when you have decided not to look at it. Into this country walks a man with a wooden box on a tripod. For most American families in 1855, the postmortem photograph is not a curiosity and it is not a luxury. It is the only image of the child that will ever exist in this world. No baby portrait, no first day of school, no wedding daguerreotype later. The face goes into the ground or it goes onto a glass plate, and the family votes with their last $2. The photographer is summoned to the house, almost always within 24 hours of death. He arrives in a covered wagon with the equipment strapped down, glass plates wrapped in oiled cloth, a black hood, a bottle of iodine, a bottle of mercury, because the mercury vapor is how the latent image is brought up off the silvered plate, and it is also slowly killing him, although he will not know that for another 40 years. A small porcelain dish of carmine powder for the cheeks, because a corpse photographs gray, and a child must not be gray. He brings a black backdrop and a velvet chair, sometimes a wicker bassinet, sometimes a small basket of dried flowers kept clean between sittings, because flowers are expensive, and he is using the same ones again on Thursday. By the time he arrives, the mother has done her work. She has washed the body herself with a cloth and water from the kitchen pump because no stranger touches her child. She has put on the christening gown or the Sunday dress, or in poorer households, a clean nightshirt borrowed from a cousin. She has placed coins on the eyelids to keep them closed, sometimes copper pennies, sometimes silver half dimes, if the family had them. The coins stay on for 20 minutes, then come off, and the eyes stay shut. If the eyes do not stay shut, the photographer notes it and continues. The eyes can be painted on the print later with a fine sable brush in a process called ocular retouching. He has a small enamel kit for this. The painted eyes look almost right, almost. The men who built this industry left their names in city directories you can pull off a shelf today. Albert Southworth and Josiah Johnson Hawes ran a studio at 19 Tremont Row in Boston from 1843 through the early 1860s. Their advertisement, reprinted in the Boston Almanac, offered to make likenesses of deceased persons either at our rooms or at private residences. Their ledger survives. In the collection of the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, the names of the dead do not. The names were never the product. The image was the product. You are in that parlor again now, different house, same year, same country. It smells of 3 things at once. Camphor, brought in by the photographer to settle his own stomach for what comes next. White vinegar, sprinkled around the body in saucers because it is July, because civilian embalming is still 20 years from being widespread, and because somebody has to slow down what is happening in that room. And lavender water, because that is what the mother sprinkled on the child's hair this morning. The way she used to do at bedtime, the way she could not stop herself from doing one last time. A clock on the mantel has stopped at the hour of death. Nobody in this house has wounded it. Nobody will for a year. In some households, never again. The shutter opens. The exposure takes between 30 and 60 seconds. Nobody breathes hard. Nobody coughs. Outside, a horse moves in the street. The light through the lace curtain shifts by an inch. The plate fixes it all into silver. The Victorians get called repressed in your high school textbook. They photographed their dead children in Sunday best and hung the result over the dining room sideboard next to the family Bible and offered tea to anyone who came to look. Repressed is not the word. Repressed is what we do. Repressed is the closed casket and the soft instrumental music and the photograph on the funeral program taken at a vacation in 2019. The Victorians looked right at it. And here is the first thing you have to give up. None of this was weird in 1860. None of it. A memento mori photograph of a dead child in a christening gown was as ordinary in an American parlor as a framed wedding certificate. The neighbors saw it when they came for tea. The minister saw it when he made his visit. The traveling salesman saw it when he came around to pitch his Singer sewing machines. Nobody flinched. Nobody whispered. The strangeness you feel right now, sitting wherever you are sitting, looking at one of these images on a screen at 1 a.m, is not a feature of the photograph. It is a feature of you, which raises the obvious question, and it is the question this channel exists to ask. So pause here for a second. I want a real answer. What ritual do you perform right now in 2026 that your great-great-granddaughter is going to find unbearable when she finds the evidence in 150 years? The dead cousin's Facebook page that keeps wishing her happy birthday every March? The ashes of your grandmother in a Pringles can on the mantelpiece because the urn was $40 at the funeral home and you were not paying that? The phone you slipped into your father's casket because you could not stand the thought of him being unreachable? Pick one. Be honest. Drop it in the comments below. The good ones get pinned. And while you are down there, hit the like button. Not for me, for the algorithm. Feed it real history for once instead of whatever it was trying to sell you 90 seconds ago. Because in the next act, we leave the gentle surface behind. The carmine on the cheeks, the lavender in the curtains, the mother's clean hands, all of it. There is a reason that child in Rochester looks asleep in that velvet chair. There is a reason her cheeks are rosy on a body that has been dead for 3 days. And it is not because death is peaceful. Something had to be done to her first. And the man with the camera was not the only one in the room when it was done. Here is what was done to her. If the photographer arrived late, and in a Pennsylvania summer in 1864 he often did, the body had already begun to change. The skin around the eyes darkened first. The lips drew back from the teeth by 1/4 of an inch. The fingers stiffened on the first day, then loosened again on the second, which is why so many of these images show hands too relaxed for a child sitting upright in her best dress. The hands are wrong because the hands had already let go twice. The mother washes the face with vinegar water. The photographer opens his enamel kit and unscrews the small porcelain dish. He thins the carmine powder with a drop of glycerin and works it into the cheeks with a sable brush, the same brush he uses to paint eyes on closed lids later. He works fast because the room is warm and he has another sitting in Allentown in the morning. He is not the only one helping. Somewhere just out of frame, an aunt holds the child's head from behind, her hand cupped under the hair at the nape of the neck. A father braces the spine with a folded coat. An older sister, 11 years old, has been given the job of standing perfectly still in the doorway because the photographer wants her in the next exposure, alive, next to her dead sister, both of them in matching white. She has been crying since Tuesday. She is not crying now. She has been told what happens to the picture if she moves. The picture is what the family will have forever. So she does not move. You have seen the other photograph, the one everyone shares on social media every October. A woman in a dark dress, hands at her sides, staring straight at the camera with a small iron stand just visible behind her ankles. The caption says, "This is a Victorian corpse propped up on a posing stand." Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments going, "Oh my God, imagine you have probably reposted one yourself." Here is the bad news. That woman is almost certainly alive. The metal posing stand often called a Brady stand after Mathew Brady's studio on Broadway, was not designed for the dead. It physically could not be. The thing is a brass rod about 4 feet tall with a single padded clamp at the top that closes gently around the back of the neck. It was designed to hold a living head, still during a long exposure, the way a dental rest holds your jaw open at the orthodontist. It could not support the dead weight of a human being. The base alone would tip. The clamp would not hold. The body would fall sideways into the chemicals. The dead, in real memento mori photography, are posed lying down, or seated and propped against pillows, or held openly by living relatives whose hands and arms you can see in the frame. The standing corpse photograph is a modern internet ghost story. It is not a real Victorian thing. It is something we invented about them because the truth was not strange enough for us. Which means almost every one of those famous spooky Victorian images you have laughed at on a Friday night is a living person. They are staring at you across 160 years because they were told not to move for 45 seconds and they did not move. Their stillness is not death. It is obedience. They are alive in the frame. They were alive when they walked out of the studio. Some of them lived into the 1920s and met their own grandchildren. The dead in these photographs are usually the relaxed ones. They are the ones with their eyes closed and their hands folded. It is the living you should be looking at, which is just a long way of saying that the internet has been laughing at Victorian people's vacation portraits and calling them corpses for the last 15 years. The Victorians would be insulted. They pay good money for those. Here is what was actually done. Eyes were closed before the exposure, weighted with coins or held shut with a strip of muslin tied gently behind the head and cropped out of the final print. If the eyes drifted open, and on the second and third day they sometimes did, the photographer painted new ones onto the print afterward with a magnifying lens and a brush with 3 hairs in it. The painted pupils are almost always slightly too large. Once you know to look for it, you cannot stop seeing it. They are looking past the camera every time. They are looking at something just over your shoulder. Heads were propped with books wrapped in dark cloth, with folded shawls, with a brick from the garden, in one Vermont case, swaddled in a sock. In group portraits, the dead child was usually placed on a parent's lap, with the parent's arms doing the work of holding her upright, and you can see the strain in the parent's fingers if you know where to look. The white knuckles in those photographs are not grief, they are mechanics. And then there is the hidden mother. In a hidden mother photograph, a small child is photographed sitting upright on what looks like a chair draped in a heavy black cloth. The cloth is not a chair. The cloth is the mother, kneeling on the chair, holding the child against her chest from behind, her face and body completely covered in black wool. The exposure is too long for a toddler to sit still alone, so the mother becomes furniture. The photographer crops her out of the print, or paints her out, or trusts the client not to look too closely. Most hidden mother photographs are exactly what they say they are: a mother, a child, both alive, a practical solution to a 30-second exposure. Most of them, there is a small subset of surviving hidden mother plates, scattered across collections in upstate New York and rural Pennsylvania, where the shape under the cloth is wrong. The shoulders sit too high. The arms come around the child from the wrong angle, as if the elbows bend the other way. In one image held at the Burns Archive in New York City, the pencil note on the reverse reads only, in the photographer's handwriting, "Third one this month." There is no record of who the third one was. There is no record of the first 2. Collectors have been noting the wrong shape under the cloth for 40 years. Nobody's explained it. Nobody seems to be in any hurry to. Out west, it got stranger. In the 1870s, traveling photographers worked the homesteads of Kansas and Nebraska alone, sometimes covering 300 miles in the season, sleeping in their wagons. There is a documented case from a sod house outside Hays, Kansas, summer of 1874, where a photographer was called to make a likeness of a stillborn infant. He arrived 2 days late because of a prairie storm. The mother had kept the child in the cool of the root cellar. The photographer set up in the only room of the house. The exposure took a full minute. The wind moved the grass outside in long, slow waves. Halfway through the exposure, he asked the mother politely to step out of the frame so that he could take a second image of the child alone. She refused. She stayed in the doorway behind him for the whole sitting, and for the next sitting, and for the one after that. He made 7 plates that afternoon. He destroyed 6 of them before he left, according to the brief note in his daybook. He did not say why. The 7th plate ended up in a private collection in Topeka. The mother is in it. She is not in the doorway. She is standing directly behind the cradle. The photographer was certain she had been behind him the entire time. By the autumn of 1862, this kind of thing was happening often enough that someone in Boston decided to make a business out of it. His name was William Mumler. He was an engraver by trade, not a photographer, and he discovered the second face in his own self-portrait by accident on a slow Tuesday afternoon in his cousin's studio on Washington Street. Standing behind him in the developed plate, half transparent with one hand resting on his shoulder, was a young girl he recognized. She had been dead for 12 years. Within 5 years, half of Grieving America would be paying him $10 apiece to find their dead in his glass plates too, including the widow of a president. Her name was Mrs. Lindell. When she walked into the studio at 170 West Springfield Street in Boston in early 1872, she wore a heavy black veil. She did not give her real name, and the young man at the front desk did not ask because Mumler had told him not to ask. She sat in the chair. She paid the $10 in coin. Mumler exposed the plate. When the print came back 2 days later, the widow saw her husband standing behind her in the photograph, with his hands resting lightly on her shoulders, looking down at her with the same tired patience he had worn in life. She wept. She tucked the photograph into her writing desk. She believed it until the day she died, 10 years later, in a borrowed room in her sister's house in Springfield, Illinois. The widow's name was Mary Todd Lincoln. The husband had been shot in the back of the head in a theater 7 years earlier. William H. Mumler was, by every reasonable measure, a fraud. He charged $10 sitting at a time when a Boston factory girl earned roughly $15 in a week. He guaranteed an extra, his word for a translucent dead face standing somewhere behind the living sitter in the developed plate. He delivered every time. He never failed a customer in 23 years of trade. He had reason to. Spirit photography in 1862 was the only growth industry in a country burying its sons in cornfields at the rate of $2,000 a week. Mumler did not invent the demand. He just put a price on it. And the price was almost always $10 payable up front. Because grief tips well, he was tried for fraud in New York in 1869. P.T. Barnum, yes, that Barnum, the circus one, testified for the prosecution. Barnum had personally commissioned a fake spirit photograph of himself standing next to a ghostly Abraham Lincoln to prove that any half-competent man with a dark room and a spare negative could do it. The fake was good. The jury saw the fake. They acquitted Mumler anyway on a technicality involving the wording of the indictment. He went back to Boston and worked another 15 years. The Mary Todd Lincoln photograph still exists. It is in a public collection in the Allen County Public Library in Indiana. You can look at it tonight on your phone in bed. The image of her dead husband behind her was almost certainly a double exposure made from a glass plate Mumler had kept from an earlier sitting with a different bearded client. Almost certainly. There are 3 other faces in the backgrounds of 3 other surviving Mumler plates that have never been identified by any researcher against any of his hundreds of cataloged earlier negatives. The faces do not match any customer in his ledger. They do not match any employee. They do not match Mumler himself. They appear once in 1 plate apiece and never again. While Mumler was making his living off the dead in the parlor, Mathew Brady was making his off the dead in the field. In October of 1862, Brady opened an exhibition in his gallery on Broadway in New York City. He called it The Dead of Antietam. It was the first time American civilians had ever seen photographs of their own war dead. Not paintings, not engravings, not artists' impressions. Photographs. Bodies bloated in the September sun, in rows, in fence corners, in a sunken road in western Maryland that the soldiers who lived through it would call Bloody Lane for the rest of their lives. The New York Times wrote the following week that Brady had brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets. The photographers who actually took those plates were Alexander Gardner and James Gibson, working under Brady's name because Brady's eyes were going and he could not see the ground glass anymore. They used the wet plate collodion process, which meant they had to coat a glass plate with chemicals, expose it in the camera, and develop it inside a sealed dark wagon, all within roughly 10 minutes before the collodion dried and ruined the image. They worked surrounded by what they were photographing. The chemicals smelled of ether and sulfur. The bodies smelled of what bodies smell like after 4 days in September heat. The flies are in the journals. Gardner's journal mentions the flies more than once. He stopped trying to wave them off after the second day. After Antietam, the post-mortem portrait of a single child in a parlor no longer felt like the worst photograph in America. The aesthetic shifted. Soldiers' bodies were photographed where they fell, before burial and sent home as carte de visite. Small albumin prints the size of a playing card, cheap enough to mail. Mothers in Maine and Indiana pasted them into albums next to wedding portraits and christening certificates. The dead were no longer hidden in the parlor. The dead were in the mail. America invented mass-produced grief in the 1860s and has not stopped innovating since. But the strangest plates are the ones that nobody can explain at all. In 1874, in a frame house outside Marietta, Ohio, the Crandall family sat for a portrait. 4 people, a father, a mother, 2 sons, aged 9 and 11. The photograph was made by a local studio, whose ledger survives in the County Historical Society. The plate was exposed twice on a single sheet of glass in the standard practice of the period. The first exposure shows the family. The second exposure, made roughly 90 seconds later as a safety duplicate, shows the family again. Same room, same chairs, same wallpaper. In the second exposure, there is a 5th figure, a small girl, standing between the 2 boys, occupying space that had been empty in the first exposure. She is approximately the same height as a 9-year-old. She is wearing a pale dress. Her face is in soft focus. She is not transparent. She is solid. She is in the photograph. The Crandall family had lost a daughter the previous winter, aged 9, to scarlet fever. The plate has been examined 3 times in the last 150 years, most recently in 1998, by a photographic historian at Ohio University. No double exposure technique known to the 1,874 wet plate collodion process can produce a solid figure where there was none before, in the same room within the same minute, with consistent lighting and focal depth across both exposures. The plate is now in a private collection somewhere in Pittsburgh. The Crandall family never sat for another photograph. There is no record of why. Then there is the Worden case. In November of 1881, a traveling photographer named Edgar Worden made 3 identical prints of a postmortem sitting for an infant in rural Bennington County, Vermont. The infant was 11 months old. Worden's working notes, preserved in the back of his daybook, describe in detail the closing of the eyes before the exposure, the weighting of the lids with 2 copper pennies, the wait of 20 minutes, the removal of the pennies, and the confirmation, in his own handwriting, that the eyes were closed. In 2 of the 3 prints, the eyes are closed. In the 3rd print, the eyes are open. The infant is looking directly at the camera. The plate is intact. No retouching is visible under magnification. The print is held at a small New England University archive that, as of 2019, no longer permits researchers to view it without a written request from a faculty member and a stated academic purpose. They will not say why. In a memento mori photograph, you are looking at a body the family wanted preserved, but you are also looking at a room and a wallpaper pattern and a corner and a window and a doorway behind the chair. You do not know who else was in that house. The exposure is long. A face does not have to stay still for the whole minute. It only has to be there for part of it. Which brings us back to that child in the velvet chair in Rochester in the autumn of 1862, the one we left waiting for you in the first 10 minutes of this video. The rosy cheeks, the closed eyes, the Sunday white, the clock on the mantle that nobody has wound. The photographer developed the plate in his hotel room 3 nights later by candlelight in a basin of mercury vapor that gave him a headache he would never quite shake. He saw what he expected to see: the child, the chair, the wallpaper, the doorway, and in the doorway, half in shadow, the figure of a woman in a dark dress standing perfectly still, looking down at the back of the child's head. The girl had been an only child. The mother had been at the kitchen table the entire sitting, 20 feet away in the next room, weeping into her apron. The photographer remembered this very clearly afterward because he had been the one to ask her to stay out of the frame. He never asked who else lived in the house. He never went back to deliver the print. If you are still with me this far in, take 15 seconds right now and hit the like button. Just do it. We are about to enter the darkest part of the story, and the algorithm needs to know you are willing to follow me there. The plate sat in that hotel room in Rochester for 3 days. Then the photographer wrapped it in oilcloth, packed it in a wooden crate with 20 other plates from 20 other houses, and shipped it east on the New York Central. He never made another post-mortem image. He took up landscape work in 1864. He died in 1,891 inches buffalo of mercury poisoning, which is what got most of them in the end. His estate sold the crate to a junk dealer for $4. It moved through 6 private collections in the next century and a half. The plates are now scattered across 3 archives in 3 different states. The girl in the velvet chair is not in any of them. Nobody knows her name. Nobody knows what killed her. Nobody knows who the woman in the doorway was, the one who was not her mother, the one who was not in the house when the photographer arrived. Nobody knows who posed her. Nobody is going to. Here is the haunting thing about the Wild West, and about the parlors of Boston, and about the sod houses of Kansas, where a stillborn child waited in a root cellar for a man with a wagon to arrive. You were sold a story about cowboys and frontiers and progress, westward expansion, manifest destiny, the taming of a continent. They wrote songs about it. They put it in your 4th grade textbook between the chapter on Lewis and Clark and the chapter on the Transcontinental Railroad. The real story is on the glass plates. The real story is that 19th century America was a country that buried its children in numbers that would today be called a humanitarian catastrophe on a continent it had taken at the cost of an even larger one, and then it sat down in clean Sunday clothes and paid a man with chemicals on his hands to make the dead look almost asleep. That was the country. That was the whole project. The cowboy hat is the marketing. The carmine cheek and the painted eye are the receipt. And here is the part nobody puts in the textbook. Every photograph you have ever taken is a memento mori. Every selfie on your camera roll. Every video of a Christmas morning your dead grandfather is in. Every wedding group photograph where 2 of the people in the back row are gone now. The technology got faster. The chemicals got cleaner. The intent did not change. You are still doing exactly what they did in 1862. You are just doing it in higher resolution and calling it content, which brings us back to a velvet chair in a parlor in Rochester in the autumn of 1862, and a small girl in a christening gown with rosy cheeks who has not blinked in 3 days. In the first minute of this video, you assume the unblinking figure in that room was the corpse in the chair. Look again. The corpse closed her eyes. The mother closed her eyes. The photographer closed his eyes when he could not stand to look at the plate anymore and turned away from the basin. The only one in that room who never looked away, the only one who has been staring at that child unblinking for 164 years, is you. If you made it this far, comment the word "survived" below. One word, all caps, so I know exactly who walked out of the parlor with me tonight. And subscribe to The Dark Ledge. The next plate is already developing.